The sun streamed through the grand bay windows of the estate, flooding the room with light. The morning buzzed with energy as family members and staff scurried around, preparing for Cora's wedding. Waylon leaned against the doorframe of the living room, coffee in hand, observing the chaos with a mix of pride and amusement. "Dad, have you seen my earrings?" Cora's voice rang out from upstairs, sharp with urgency. Her footsteps thundered down the staircase, her silk robe billowing behind her. "Check the dresser in your room, sweetheart," Waylon said, his voice calm. "They should be in the little silver box." Cora huffed, throwing her hands in the air. "They're not there? I'm going to be late. Why is everything going wrong today?" "Relax," Waylon said, setting his coffee down on a side table. "Take a breath. I'll help you look." Lucia appeared from the hallway, her fitted dress swishing softly as she walked. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup subtle but flawless. "What's wrong now?" she asked, placing a reassuring hand on Cora's shoulder. "The earrings are gone," Cora said, her frustration barely contained. "I'm sure I put them on the dresser, but they're not there." Lucia shot Waylon a look. "Can you check the car? Maybe they fell out of the bag when we were unloading the gifts yesterday." Waylon nodded. On it, he grabbed his keys from the kitchen counter and headed outside. The crisp morning air was a welcome change from the heated energy inside. He popped open the trunk of the car and sifted through the bags. Sure enough, a small velvet box lay wedged between two larger packages. He smiled to himself, picking it up. When he returned, Cora's face lit up. "Dad, you're a lifesaver." She grabbed the box and dashed upstairs, shouting a quick "thank you" over her shoulder. Waylon chuckled. "Well, that's one crisis averted." Lucia approached him, a warm smile on her face. "Everything's perfect, Waylon. Thank you for making all of this happen." She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "It's not just me," he said, gesturing toward the house full of people. "This is for our family. For Cora. She deserves this." Lucia nodded, her smile lingering, but Waylon noticed a flicker of something in her eyes, a shadow of unease. He decided not to press her on it. Today was about Cora, and he wanted nothing to ruin the moment. As the day progressed, the house became a whirlwind of activity. The florist arrived with truckloads of white roses, filling the air with their sweet aroma. The caterers unloaded trays of hors d'oeuvres, and the photographer darted around, snapping candid shots of the family. Waylon busied himself, ensuring everything was running smoothly. "Dad, where should we set up the photo booth?" Max, his second eldest, asked, dragging a heavy box into the living room. "The far corner by the patio," Waylon said. "It'll get plenty of natural light there." Max nodded and called for help from his younger brother, Jordan. Waylon watched as the two bickered over how to carry the equipment, their voices blending into the symphony of sounds filling the house. It was chaotic but heartwarming, the kind of family chaos he had come to treasure. As Waylon stepped outside to oversee the final touches on the garden decorations, he noticed his best friend, Matthew, arriving. Matthew strolled up the driveway, his tailored suit impeccable as always. His charismatic grin was the same one that had charmed everyone over the years. He waved at Waylon, holding up a bottle of champagne. "Figured we'd need this," Matthew said, his voice loud and cheerful. "Always prepared," Waylon replied, clapping him on the back. "How's life treating you?" "You know me," Matthew said with a wink. "Living the dream." They chatted briefly before Lucia appeared, her eyes lighting up when she saw Matthew. "There you are," she said, her tone unusually warm. She leaned in and gave him a quick hug. "We got some catching up to do. Don't you dare disappear before the reception." "Wouldn't dream of it," Matthew replied, his grin widening. Waylon watched the interaction, a faint unease stirring in his chest. He dismissed it. Lucia and Matthew had always been close, and there was no reason to think anything of it. Still, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. The hours ticked by, and soon the ceremony was about to begin. Guests gathered in the garden, the rows of white chairs filling quickly. Waylon took his seat in the front row, Lucia beside him. Cora looked radiant as she walked down the aisle, her dress shimmering in the sunlight. Waylon felt a lump in his throat as he watched her approach the altar. This was what it was all for, the sacrifices, the late nights, the years of hard work. His family was his pride and joy, and moments like this made it all worth it. Lucia leaned over and whispered, "She's beautiful. Isn't she?" "She is," Waylon replied, his voice thick with emotion. As the vows were exchanged, Waylon's mind wandered briefly to the years he had spent building this life. He thought of the struggles, the triumphs, and the love that had sustained them. But that flicker of unease remained, a small crack in the otherwise perfect facade. When the ceremony concluded and the guests erupted into applause, Waylon joined in, his hands clapping loudly. He pushed the nagging thoughts aside, determined to focus on the joy of the moment. As the family gathered for photos, he watched his children interact with Matthew, their laughter infectious. Yet something about their closeness struck him as odd. He brushed it off again, convincing himself he was overthinking. Today was not the day for doubts. Today was for celebrating his daughter and the family he had worked so hard to create. For now, he would let the picture-perfect facade remain intact, unaware that the cracks would soon shatter it entirely. The garden was a picturesque scene of perfection. White roses lined the aisle, their fragrance blending with the crisp autumn air. Guests mingled, their laughter and chatter creating a lively backdrop. Waylon moved through the crowd, a glass of champagne in hand, greeting family and friends with a warm smile. Cora's wedding was everything he had envisioned, a moment of joy that years of hard work had made possible. He spotted his children, Cora, Max, Brielle, Jordan, and Lucas, gathered near the fountain. They surrounded Matthew, their faces alight with laughter as he animatedly recounted a story. Waylon's heart swelled. His children and his best friend had always shared a close bond, something he had cherished. But then something caught his eye. Lucia walked up to Matthew. The ease with which she moved toward him seemed natural. But the moment her arms wrapped around his neck and their lips met, Waylon's world tilted. It wasn't the friendly peck of old friends. It lingered, intimate and unapologetic. Waylon's breath caught. Was he imagining this? He stepped closer, weaving through the crowd unnoticed. The sounds of laughter and music blurred as his ears honed in on their voices. Lucia's voice was low but unmistakable. "Can you believe he still thinks he's been raising his own kids?" she said, a sly smile curling her lips. "We convinced him all these years that the procedure worked. They're yours, babe. And now this loser's even funded this extravagant $1 million wedding." Waylon felt his chest tighten. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought the urge to scream. Procedure? Convinced him? What was she talking about? He stayed frozen, hoping he'd misheard. Lucas, his youngest, spoke up next, his tone light but laced with derision. "We pretended to be good little kids for him. Uncle Matthew's our real dad, anyway." The words hit Waylon like a sledgehammer. He stumbled back a step, his vision blurring. The crowd around him carried on, oblivious to his silent devastation. Years of memories flashed through his mind. Family dinners, birthdays, late-night talks with Lucia about their dreams for their children. It had all been a lie. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to piece together the fragments of his shattered world. A waiter approached with a tray of champagne, breaking Waylon's trance. "Sir, would you like another glass?" Waylon waved him off, his voice hoarse. "No, thank you." He turned and walked briskly toward the house, needing a moment to think, to process. Inside, the noise of the wedding faded, replaced by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant chatter from the garden. He set his glass down on the counter, gripping the edge for support. His mind raced, replaying the scene over and over. Footsteps approached. Lucia entered the kitchen, her expression cheerful. "There you are," she said, crossing the room to him. "Everything okay?" "You disappeared." Waylon forced a tight smile. "Just needed a breather." "It's a big day." Lucia nodded, pouring herself a glass of wine. "I know. Cora's so happy. You've done an incredible job, Waylon. None of this would have been possible without you." Her words, once a source of pride, now felt hollow. He studied her, searching for a trace of guilt, but her demeanor was calm, unbothered. How long had she been deceiving him? And Matthew, his closest friend, The man he had trusted with everything. How could he have been so blind? "Where's Matthew?" Waylon asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Lucia's eyes flickered briefly. "He's probably with the kids. You know how they adore him." Waylon nodded, swallowing the bitterness rising in his throat. "Yeah, they do." He needed proof, something undeniable. Without a word, he left the kitchen, heading upstairs to his office. He locked the door behind him and powered on his computer. Over the years, he had meticulously kept records of everything: medical documents, financial statements, emails. If there was evidence of Lucia and Matthew's betrayal, he would find it. He opened the folder containing the children's medical files. His heart pounded as he skimmed through the records. Cora's file confirmed she was born through IVF, a process they had undergone together. But the timeline didn't add up. According to the records, the procedure had failed multiple times before her birth. And the DNA test results from a routine checkup, something he hadn't thought twice about at the time, indicated a paternal discrepancy. Waylon's stomach churned. He checked Max's file next, then Brielle's, Jordan's, and finally Lucas's. The same pattern emerged. None of the children shared his DNA. The betrayal was undeniable. Lucia and Matthew had woven an intricate web of lies, exploiting his love and trust to their advantage. The weight of the revelation threatened to crush him, but a spark of resolve ignited within him. He wouldn't let them destroy him. Not today. Waylon returned to the garden, his face a mask of composure. The ceremony was about to begin, and guests were taking their seats. Lucia stood by the entrance, radiant and poised. She reached for his hand, and he let her take it, though his grip was cold. He loved her, loved all his children, despite everything. But he couldn't ignore the truth. The life he had built was a lie, and he would have to face the consequences of that truth, for himself and for them. Waylon stood rooted at the edge of the garden, the weight of the revelations threatening to suffocate him. The sound of laughter and conversation swirled around him, but it felt distant, muted. His vision narrowed on Lucia and Matthew, who now stood with Cora and the rest of the children, chatting as if nothing had happened. His blood boiled. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. The chatter faded as Waylon's voice rang out, loud and commanding. "Stop everything." Heads turned in his direction, confusion rippling through the crowd. Guests exchanged puzzled glances, their smiles fading. "This wedding is over," Waylon announced, his voice steady but laced with fury. "There will be no vows today, not after what I just heard." Gasps and whispers erupted among the guests. Cora's face turned pale as she clutched the bouquet tighter. "Dad, what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. Waylon's eyes bore into Lucia and Matthew. "Ask your mother and Uncle Matthew," he said, spitting the word with venom. "Or better yet, ask yourself who you've been calling Dad all these years." Lucia's face drained of color. She stepped forward, raising her hands as if to calm him. "Waylon, please, let's not make a scene." Waylon's laugh was cold and bitter. "Oh, we're way past that, Lucia. You made the scene when you decided to lie, cheat, and betray me for years. Tell them, Lucia. Tell them the truth." Matthew tried to interject, stepping between them. "Waylon, maybe we should talk about this in private." "Shut up, Matthews." Waylon snapped, his voice rising. "You don't get to play the peacemaker. Not after what you've done." The crowd's murmurs grew louder as the tension escalated. Cora's hands trembled as she looked between her parents. "Mom, what is he talking about?" Lucia's lips quivered, but she remained silent. Her silence was answer enough. Waylon turned to the children, his eyes brimming with pain. "You all knew, didn't you? You knew, and you kept this from me." Lucas, the youngest, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence evaporating. "Dad, I mean, it's complicated. Don't call me that." Waylon's voice cracked. "I'm not your dad. Apparently, I never was." Cora dropped her bouquet, the flowers scattering on the ground. "Mom, is this true?" Lucia reached for her daughter, but Cora stepped back. I can explain," Lucia stammered, tears pooling in her eyes. Waylon shook his head, his fists clenched at his sides. "No more lies, Lucia. Just admit it. Admit that you and Matthew have been playing me for a fool. Matthew's voice turned defensive. Waylon, you're blowing this out of proportion. This isn't the time or place. Waylon's glare could have cut steel. You don't get to dictate anything here. You destroyed my family, my life. And now, you're going to face the consequences. Cora's voice rose above the chaos, trembling with desperation. What does this mean for the wedding? For us? Waylon's gaze softened as he looked at her, but his resolve remained firm. It means there is no wedding, Cora. I can't stand here and pretend to celebrate a family built on lies. Lucia's tears streamed down her face as she fell to her knees. Waylon, please. I made mistakes, but don't punish the children for my actions. They love you. Do they? Waylon shot back. Because from what I heard, they've been laughing behind my back, pretending to be my kids while knowing the truth. Lucas stepped forward hesitantly. It's not like that, Dad. I mean, Waylon. We didn't mean to hurt you. Didn't mean to hurt me? Waylon repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You conspired with your mother and Matthew to keep me in the dark. That's not just hurtful. That's cruel. The guests began to disperse, their whispered judgments carried on the wind. Waylon took a deep breath, his voice steadier now, but no less resolute. This ends today. Cora, Max, Brielle, Jordan, Lucas, you're all adults now. You can choose to stay with your mother and Matthew, but don't expect me to be part of your lives anymore. You made your choices. Lucia crawled toward him, clutching his pant leg. Please, Waylon, don't do this. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. Waylon pulled away, his face hard. You had years to come clean, Lucia. Years to show me even an ounce of respect. You chose deceit instead. There's no fixing this. He turned to the wedding planner, who stood frozen near the arch. Call it off. Send everyone home. This wedding is over. Cora sobbed openly as Waylon walked away, his steps purposeful. The weight of betrayal still pressed heavily on him, but he knew one thing for certain. He was done being a pawn in their game. The life he had built might have been a lie, but his future would be his own, free of deceit, free of them. The days that followed the wedding felt like a blur to Waylon, though each moment was charged with action and decision. He wasn't the type to let betrayal paralyze him. If anything, it fueled his resolve to reclaim control of his life. On the morning after the disastrous wedding, Waylon sat at the mahogany desk in his home office, a steaming cup of coffee untouched beside him. His lawyer's voice on the other end of the phone was calm and measured, but Waylon's emotions were anything but. Divorce proceedings can be initiated immediately, the lawyer assured him. Given the circumstances, we can build a strong case. I'll also update your will to reflect the changes you mentioned. Do it, Waylon replied, his tone cold. I want them removed from everything. No inheritance, no trust funds, nothing. Later that day, Lucia stormed into his office, her face a storm of fury and desperation. Waylon, this is insane, she snapped, slamming the door behind her. You can't just cut the kids out of the will. They didn't do anything wrong. Waylon leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Didn't they? He asked coolly. They lied to my face for years, Lucia. They laughed behind my back while calling another man their father. That's not innocent. Tears streaked down Lucia's cheeks. They're your children in every way that matters. You raised them, you love them. How can you just throw them away? Waylon stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Don't you dare lecture me on love, Lucia. You destroyed this family with your lies. You and Matthew turned my life into a joke. And now you expect me to act like nothing happened? It wasn't like that, Lucia pleaded, her voice breaking. I made mistakes, but it was never about hurting you. Stop, Waylon said, holding up a hand. You don't get to rewrite the narrative. This was calculated. You knew exactly what you were doing. Lucia's tone turned accusatory. And what about the kids? You think punishing them makes you the better person? They're not responsible for my choices. Waylon's jaw tightened. They're adults, Lucia. They made their choices when they aligned themselves with you and Matthew. Actions have consequences. The next confrontation came with Matthew. The man had the audacity to show up at Waylon's office unannounced. Waylon, can we talk? Matthew said, stepping inside before Waylon could refuse. His demeanor was a mix of guilt and entitlement, which only made Waylon angrier. "I have nothing to say to you," Waylon replied, barely looking up from the paperwork on his desk. Matthew sighed, sitting down uninvited. "Look, I screwed up. I know that. But we've been friends for decades. Doesn't that mean anything?" Waylon finally looked up, his eyes piercing. "Friends? You call yourself my friend? You slept with my wife. You fathered my kids. And then you stood beside me at every milestone like nothing was wrong. You're not my friend. You're a parasite." Matthew flinched, but pressed on. "The kids, our kids, still need you. You're the only father they've ever known." Waylon's voice turned icy. "No, Matthew. They're your kids. You wanted the titles so badly? Now you can have the responsibility that comes with it." Matthew opened his mouth to argue, but Waylon cut him off. "Get out, and don't come back." The children's reactions were a mix of anger, guilt, and denial. Cora was the first to confront him, her eyes red from crying. "Dad, you're being unfair," she exclaimed, standing in the doorway of his study. "We didn't ask to be born into this situation. None of this is our fault." Waylon put down the pen he was holding and looked at her. "You're right," he said evenly. "You didn't ask for this. But you knew the truth, Cora. And instead of coming to me, you chose to keep me in the dark. That's a choice you made. But we love you," Cora insisted, her voice cracking. "You're our dad. You always will be." Waylon's expression softened for a moment before hardening again. "I loved you too, Cora. I still do. But love doesn't erase betrayal. I can't go back to the way things were." Max was next, his tone angrier than his sister's. "So that's it? You're just going to abandon us? Pretend we don't exist?" Waylon's patience wore thin. "I'm not pretending anything, Max. I'm facing the reality you all hid from me. If you want someone to blame, look at your mother and Matthew." Brielle, Jordan, and Lucas tried a more conciliatory approach, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. The betrayal was too deep, the wounds too fresh. By the end of the week, Waylon had made his decisions clear. Lucia moved out of the house, taking the children with her. The once bustling home was now eerily quiet, but Waylon found solace in the silence. For the first time in years, he felt free, not from fatherhood or responsibility, but from lies. One evening, as Waylon sat alone in the living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Lucia. "I know you're angry, but please think about the kids. They still need you." Waylon stared at the screen for a long time before typing a response. "They have you and Matthew. That's enough." He hit send and placed the phone face down on the table. The past was behind him now, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let their betrayal define his future. The fallout had been messy, painful, and irrevocable. But it was also a turning point, a chance for Waylon to rebuild his life on his own terms. Months slipped by, each one peeling away the layers of pain that had consumed Waylon's life. The once bustling house now stood quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had marked his days before the revelation. Waylon had filled the silence with purpose. His mornings began early with runs through the park, the rhythmic pounding of his feet on the pavement offering a sense of clarity and control. One such morning, his phone buzzed with a message from an old friend, Peter. "Hey, haven't seen you in ages. Let's catch up. Drinks on me?" Waylon hesitated before replying. For years, his life had revolved around his family and their endless demands. He had neglected friendships, choosing instead to pour every ounce of his energy into a home built on lies. "Sure, tonight works. Let me know the place." That evening, Waylon found himself at a quiet bar, a place he hadn't visited in over a decade. Peter greeted him with a hearty slap on the back. "Look at you," Peter said, motioning for 2 beers. "I was starting to think you'd fallen off the grid." Waylon chuckled, though the sound lacked humor. "Life got complicated." Peter's brow furrowed. "I heard about the wedding. Word travels fast." Waylon sighed. "It's a long story, but let's just say I've learned who my real family isn't." The conversation flowed easily after that, with Peter offering both sympathy and the kind of blunt honesty Waylon hadn't realized he needed. "Look, man," Peter said, leaning back in his chair. "You've been through hell, no doubt. But you're here, alive, and you've got a clean slate. Don't waste it wallowing. The word stayed with Waylon long after he left the bar. A month later, Waylon attended a business conference in Chicago, a last-minute decision that felt more like an obligation than an opportunity. The opening reception buzzed with energy, a sea of professionals networking with practiced ease. Waylon had just settled by the bar, nursing a whiskey, when a woman's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Is this seat taken?" He turned to see a woman about his age, her auburn hair swept into a loose bun. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, her smile warm but not forced. "Go ahead," Waylon said, gesturing to the seat beside him. "Thanks," she said, sliding onto the stool. "I'm Oakley, by the way." "Waylon." Oakley extended a hand, and Waylon shook it, surprised by the steadiness of her grip. "Not a fan of these things either?" she asked, nodding toward the bustling crowd. Waylon smirked. "Let's just say I'm here for the free drinks." Oakley laughed, a genuine sound that broke through Waylon's guarded demeanor. As the evening wore on, their conversation deepened. Oakley was a psychologist, attending the conference as a guest speaker on workplace mental health. She spoke with passion, her insights tinged with humor that made even serious topics feel accessible. "So, Waylon," she said, setting her drink down, "what brings you here?" "Business," he said simply. Oakley tilted her head. "And yet, you look like you'd rather be anywhere else. Am I wrong?" Waylon hesitated, then shrugged. "Let's just say I've had a rough year." Her eyes softened. "Want to talk about it?" For reasons he couldn't quite explain, Waylon found himself opening up. He told her about the wedding, the betrayal, and the fallout that followed. Oakley listened intently, her expression never wavering into pity, only understanding. "That's a lot," she said when he finished. "I can't imagine how that must have felt." Waylon chuckled bitterly. "It felt like my entire life was a lie." "But it wasn't," Oakley said gently. "Your love for them was real. That doesn't go away just because they didn't deserve it." Her words struck a chord, and Waylon found himself nodding. Over the next few months, Waylon and Oakley's connection deepened. They started meeting regularly, sharing meals and conversations that felt refreshingly honest. Oakley challenged Waylon to confront his fears, particularly his struggle to trust again. During one of their dinners, she leaned forward, her tone playful yet serious. "So, when are you going to let go of the anger?" Waylon frowned. "I'm not angry." Oakley raised an eyebrow. "You filed for divorce, cut off your kids, and basically erased your past. That's not the move of a man at peace." Her words stung, but Waylon couldn't deny their truth. "What would you suggest?" he asked. Oakley smiled. "Start small. Write a letter to yourself. Say everything you wish someone had said to you during that time. Then burn it." Waylon rolled his eyes. "Sounds cliché." "Maybe," she said, her smile widening. "But clichés exist for a reason." One evening, Waylon sat in his study, a blank piece of paper in front of him. He stared at it for what felt like hours before finally picking up a pen. "Dear Waylon," he wrote, "you deserve better. You loved with your whole heart, and that was never a weakness. What happened to you says more about them than it does about you." The words came slowly at first, but soon they poured out in a torrent. By the time he finished, Waylon felt a strange sense of release. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. The next morning, he called Oakley. "I did it," he said without preamble. Her laughter was warm. And maybe you were right," he admitted. With Oakley's support, Waylon began to rebuild not just his life, but his sense of self. He took up painting, a hobby he hadn't indulged in since college. He reconnected with old friends, some of whom had distanced themselves during his years of isolation. For the first time in a long time, Waylon felt like himself again. One afternoon, as he and Oakley strolled through a park, she turned to him with a serious expression. "Do you ever think about reconciliation?" she asked. "With Lucia and the kids?" Waylon clarified. Oakley nodded. Waylon sighed. "I don't know. Part of me wants to, but another part is scared," Oakley finished for him. Waylon nodded. Oakley placed a hand on his arm. "Take your time. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of hate." Waylon smiled, grateful for her wisdom. You make it sound so easy. It's not, she said, squeezing his arm. But it's worth it. As they continued walking, Waylon felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. For the first time, the future didn't seem so daunting. It felt like a new dawn. The once grand life Lucia and Matthew had enjoyed crumbled piece by piece. Waylon had been thorough in cutting them out. Lucia's social circle, once filled with affluent friends and endless invitations, grew cold and distant. Gossip spread like wildfire after the scandal broke, and the people who had once envied her life now whispered about her betrayal. Their financial situation deteriorated rapidly, with Waylon's lawyers ensuring Lucia received minimal in the divorce settlement. Her lavish lifestyle was unsustainable. The sprawling suburban home was sold to pay off debts, replaced by a cramped apartment on the edge of town. Matthew's charm, which had once helped him climb the social ladder, no longer opened doors. His reputation as a homewrecker made finding work nearly impossible. Lucia sat at the small kitchen table, a stack of unpaid bills in front of her. Her hands trembled as she calculated how far behind they were. "Matthew, we need money," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. Matthew leaned against the counter, nursing a cheap beer. "You think I don't know that?" he snapped. "I've been trying, Lucia. Nobody wants to hire me after what happened." Her eyes flashed with anger. "You think this is just on you? I lost everything too. My friends, my reputation, my life. And whose fault is that?" Matthew shot back. "You wanted it all, Waylon's money, the kids, and me. Now look where we are." The argument spiraled, as it often did, into accusations and shouting. The walls of their apartment seemed to shrink around them, echoing their misery back at them. The children, once a source of Lucia's pride, had grown increasingly distant. Cora, who had always idolized her mother, was the most vocal in her anger. One afternoon, she visited the apartment, her face tight with frustration. "Why did you do this to us, Mom?" Cora demanded, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. "You've destroyed everything." Lucia motioned for her to come in, but Cora stayed where she was. "I don't understand," Cora continued. "Dad gave you everything. We had a perfect life. Why wasn't that enough?" Lucia's voice faltered. "It's not that simple, Cora. Your father and I, we had our problems." "Problems?" Cora's voice rose. "That's your excuse? You lied to him, to us, for years. You let us think he was our dad when all along it was." She broke off, her voice choked with emotion. Matthew entered the room, attempting to calm the situation. "Cora, let's not do this now. Don't even start." Cora snapped, her glare cutting through him. "You're just as much to blame. You're both selfish, and now we're paying for it." Lucia reached for Cora, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. I never wanted this for you. But you did it anyway," Cora said, stepping back. "And now, none of us have a family anymore." The younger children were no more forgiving. Lucas, who had once adored Matthew as a cool uncle, refused to speak to him. Max and Brielle moved out of state, cutting ties completely. Jordan, the most reserved of the siblings, sent a curt email to Lucia. "I can't be part of this anymore. Don't contact me." Lucia read the message over and over, her heart sinking further with each read. Even within their diminished world, Lucia and Matthew's relationship grew toxic. They began to blame each other for their fall from grace. "You could have stopped it," Lucia hissed during yet another argument. "You could have told me this was a bad idea. And you could have told Waylon the truth years ago," Matthew retorted. "Maybe you wouldn't have cut us off if you had some integrity." "Integrity?" Lucia laughed bitterly. Coming from the man who seduced his best friend's wife? Their fights became a near-daily occurrence, wearing down whatever remnants of affection they had left. The apartment grew suffocating, a constant reminder of their failures. One evening, Lucia sat alone, scrolling through old photos on her phone. Pictures of family vacations, holidays, and birthdays stared back at her. In every one, Waylon's face was present, smiling, supportive, unsuspecting. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had destroyed a man who had only ever loved her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find Cora standing there, her face etched with a mix of anger and sorrow. "Why are you here?" Lucia asked cautiously. "I wanted to see if you're okay," Cora said, stepping inside. Lucia's eyes welled up. "I don't deserve your kindness, Cora. I'm not here to forgive you," Cora said firmly. "But I needed to say this. You ruined Dad's life, and ours too. You might have thought you were doing what made you happy, but all you did was hurt people. I hope you think about that every day." Cora turned to leave, pausing at the door. "For what it's worth, I don't think Dad will ever hate us as much as you think. But you? I don't know if he'll ever forgive you." The door clicked shut, leaving Lucia alone once more. Matthew, meanwhile, had taken to spending long hours away from the apartment, often at the same bar where Waylon had found solace months earlier. But Matthew's visits were different. His presence was marked by bitterness and self-pity. The regulars avoided him, sensing the weight of his anger. One night, as he sat nursing his third drink, he overheard a conversation at the bar. "Did you hear about Waylon? He's dating again. Good for him after what his ex put him through." Matthew's jaw tightened. He slammed his glass down, drawing startled glances. "What's your problem?" the bartender asked. "Nothing," Matthew muttered, throwing cash on the counter before storming out. The following morning, Matthew returned to the apartment to find Lucia staring blankly at the bills. "We can't keep living like this," he said. "And what do you suggest?" Lucia asked, her voice devoid of emotion. "I don't know. Maybe we move. Start fresh somewhere else." Lucia shook her head. "There's no starting fresh, Matthew. Not after what we've done. This is it. This is our life now." The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating them both. As days turned into weeks, Lucia and Matthew's lives became a monotonous cycle of regret and resentment. Their downfall was complete, and the reality of their choices loomed over them like a dark cloud. The vibrant, affluent world they had once inhabited was gone, replaced by a stark and unrelenting loneliness. Lucia sat by the window one afternoon, watching the rain streak down the glass. She thought of Waylon, how he had walked away with his head held high, leaving them to wallow in the mess they had created. For the first time, she envied him, not for his wealth or success, but for his strength. She whispered to herself, he deserved better, but it was too late. Waylon's new life began quietly, but every step forward felt like a victory. Moving into a modest yet elegant home in a peaceful neighborhood, he found solace in the simplicity he had long overlooked. The sprawling estates and lavish events of his past life now felt like remnants of someone else's story. The first months after the fallout were anything but easy. Nights were the hardest, the silence often filled with echoes of arguments, laughter that turned out to be false, and moments he now knew were built on lies. Therapy sessions became a routine, where he slowly unraveled years of suppressed hurt. Oakley entered his life almost by accident. They met at a business conference, her warm demeanor standing out in the sea of handshakes and formalities. Their initial conversation was casual, but something about her made Waylon pause. "So, what do you do to unwind after all this professional networking?" she asked, smiling over her coffee. Waylon chuckled, the question catching him off guard. "Honestly, I'm still figuring that out." "Well," she said, tilting her head, "maybe it's time to try something new." Their exchange was light, unburdened by the weight of his past, and it left him curious. Over the following months, they stayed in touch, their conversations deepening with each meeting. Oakley's honesty was disarming, and her patience gave Waylon room to open up. One evening, as they walked through a quiet park, Waylon finally shared the story he had been holding back. "I was married for 20 years, he began. "I thought I had a perfect family. Turns out, I was the only one who believed that." Oakley listened intently, her expression a mix of empathy and quiet strength. He recounted the betrayal, the confrontation, and the painful aftermath. "That's a lot to carry," she said softly when he finished. Waylon nodded, staring at the path ahead. "Some days I wonder if I'll ever really move on. It's like the pain has become a part of me." "It might always be a part of you," Oakley said, her voice gentle but firm. "But it doesn't have to control you. You've already started rebuilding. That takes courage. Her words stayed with him, a reminder that healing wasn't about erasing the past, but learning to live with it. Waylon's relationship with Oakley deepened, but he took his time. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to be vulnerable, and Oakley met him there without judgment. They shared quiet evenings cooking together, mornings exploring local markets, and afternoons hiking trails that gave them both a sense of peace. One morning, as they sat on the back porch of Waylon's new home, Oakley turned to him. "Do you think you'll ever forgive them?" she asked, not unkindly. He considered her question, his brow furrowed. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've let go of the anger mostly. But forgiveness? That feels different." "Maybe forgiveness isn't about them," Oakley suggested. "Maybe it's about freeing yourself." Months turned into a year, and Waylon found himself in a place he hadn't expected: contentment. His career flourished as he poured himself into work, not as a distraction, but as a way to rediscover his passion. He reconnected with old friends, people who had been sidelined during his marriage, and built a support system that felt authentic. The children had reached out sporadically, each interaction tentative. Cora was the first to ask for a meeting, her voice trembling over the phone. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "can we talk? I know I don't deserve it, but I miss you." Waylon agreed, and they met at a small cafe. Cora's eyes were filled with guilt as she sat across from him. "I'm so sorry for everything," she began. "I should have told you the truth, but I didn't know how. I was scared of losing our family." Waylon studied her, his expression unreadable. "You didn't just lose me. You lost trust, Cora. That's not something that comes back overnight." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I understand. I want to try, if you'll let me." Their conversation was a start, though Waylon kept his boundaries firm. Over time, similar moments unfolded with his other children, each seeking to mend what had been broken. The day Waylon proposed to Oakley was unremarkable in its setting, a quiet evening at home, but extraordinary in its meaning. "I've spent so much of my life chasing a version of happiness that wasn't real," he said, holding her hands. "With you it feels different. It feels honest. I want to keep building this life with you." Oakley smiled, tears glistening in her eyes as she nodded. "Yes, Waylon, I'd love that." Their wedding was a small, intimate ceremony held in a garden, surrounded by a few close friends and Oakley's family. Waylon didn't invite his children, a decision he made after much reflection. He needed this moment to be about his new beginning, unshadowed by the past. One evening, as Waylon stood on the balcony of their home, he gazed out at the setting sun. Oakley joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "My life," he said, his tone reflective but calm. "How far I've come. How much I've lost and gained." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You've built something beautiful, Waylon, and you've done it on your own terms." He smiled, the weight on his chest feeling lighter than it had in years. The pain of betrayal still lingered, but it no longer defined him. It was a scar, a reminder of where he had been, but not of where he was going. In that moment, Waylon felt a deep sense of peace. His life wasn't perfect, but it was his, and that was enough.